Hey, would you like to melt your own gold and cast your own bars? I mean, you might have all kinds of things, be it a placer, small fines, jewelry scrap, electronics scrap. You know, there's lots of things that have gold in it, and it's so much easier to melt it down and pour into a bar or a button. The melting temperature of gold is fairly up there. It's kind of a bright red heat at about 1064 centigrade or 1947 Fahrenheit. That's for pure gold. Now, if there's anything alloyed in your gold, any silver or other stuff, that will change the melting temperature, but that's the temperatures for pure gold, and that's what you need to be able to get to and safely above that in order to melt and pour and cast your own gold bars. Now, melting or smelting, whatever you want to call it, is not an ore processing method. I get questions. I do a number of videos where I melt some gold, and I've never really done a whole video where I talk about all the details, and that's what this video is going to be. Hey, I'm Chris Ralph, the professional prospector, and this video is going to tell you everything you need to know about melting and or smelting your own gold. Now, like I say, it's not an ore processing method. I get people who say, well, I have some gold ore, I'm just going to break it up and then melt it all down. It's like, yeah, that doesn't make sense. What you do for the melting or smelting is you break up the gold into fine sand and powder. You process it. If you have just a small amount, you could just pan it. If you have a little bit larger, you might want to use a sluice box. If you're going to be having a lot and you want to get the best results, maybe you use a shaker table or some sort of centrifuge that's designed for that. You know, a bowl type thing. Centrifugal bowl is a popular processing method for gold ores. But you want to be processing concentrates. Now, concentrates vary all over the map. You can have concentrates that are, 75 or 80% gold, or you can have concentrates that are 5 or 10% gold. If you guys ever watch Mount Baker, Mining and Metals, Jason, I know Jason's a good guy. He processes some hard rock ores, and what he gets off, he usually pans carefully, but he ends up with a mixture that's, maybe 20% gold, something like that. And he uses various melting techniques, and we're going to talk about those. But you use a flux, and let's talk about fluxes. What is a flux? Well, a flux is a chemical, usually some sort of salt, that will melt fairly easily, melt at a temperature much lower than the gold, and that kind of helps clean the gold and get it to come together as a single mass, so that when you pour it, you don't get a whole bunch of little flecks of gold dispersed through a molten slag type material. Instead, the slag, which melts easy, is much lighter than the gold, and the gold sinks to the bottom and congeals and collects into a single bit of metal that you can then pour into a bar or a button. Okay, well, what different kinds of fluxes? And there's a number of different kinds of fluxes and a number of different chemicals that commonly go into a flux, and we're going to talk about those in detail. And then the next question we'll get to afterwards is, what amount? How much flux should I use? And that's another one it's not a simple answer. So let's talk about what goes into a flux first. All right, well, the main thing, one of the two biggest things that go into fluxes is sodium carbonate, bicarbonate. Now, the bicarbonate is, your standard Arm & Hammer baking, and it's not baking soda, but the Arm & Hammer soda, and there's also sodium carbonate that you can buy under different names. And sodium carbonate is a salt that melts easily. It's pretty stable. It won't decompose easily, and melts easily and helps the gold collect and helps clean the gold. Borax, that's another one that's commonly used. I always use sodium carbonate and borax. I may have other things in there, but I always have a good amount of both sodium carbonate and borax when I do a gold melt. Because both these things are chemicals that can help clean your gold. Now, one of the things about fluxing and that kind of stuff and melting gold is all gold has some level of impurities in it. And there's both metallic impurities and non-metallic impurities. Okay, so metallic impurities are, like your gold is, say, 90% pure, it's 10% silver, okay? Or your gold is 80% pure and it's 15% silver and 5% copper. Those kinds of things are the metallic impurities in your gold. And by melting your gold, you're not going to change that. So if you start out with gold that's 90% gold and 10% silver, when you pour it into a button, it's going to be 90% gold and 10% silver. But the other impurities that are often with gold, especially if I'm going to melt some gold and show you guys in a minute, but that's a lot of that stuff is dry wash concentrates. And there's little bits of iron oxide and pyrite and probably a little tiny bit of quartz in there too. And that's the stuff that gets absorbed into the flux. So when I melt that stuff, the iron oxides will go into the flux, the quartz, the silica will go into the flux, any kinds of other black sands that goes into the flux, that sort of thing. That's not a metal, right? Like I'm going to say, the gold and silver and copper that are naturally alloyed with your natural gold, or if you got 14 karat scrap, it's got a certain amount of gold and a ratio of, if it's 14 karat, it's 58% gold and the rest is other metals, silver and copper and other things. So the metallic stuff isn't changed, but the non-metallic stuff, especially like I say with natural placer concentrates or hard rock, same thing, you're trying to separate the non-metal materials that are in that concentrate and get down to just the metal. That's what you want to pour as your bar. So sodium carbonate, borax, and silica are all really good chemicals that will help take that stuff. The sodium carbonate and the borax are great for iron oxides and things like that. And of course, great for silica, any kind of quartz that you have in yours. And it will also take care of a certain small amount of pyrite. Like my cons from dry washing, it's a hard rock mining area, and is some pyrite, not a lot, but a little bit, and it will take care of that and help put that, it'll go into the flux. The flux can't absorb very much pyrite. There's things that you do to deal with that if you do have a lot of pyrite. We'll talk about that in a second. All right, silica. If you have ores that don't have very much quartz in them naturally, then you want to add some silica. Silica is quartz. You want to add some very fine quartz. Sometimes I use broken pieces of glass. I use old antique glass that's already shattered. It's not like I'm taking a good piece of antique glassware that's valuable as an antique. I'm taking broken shards and that kind of stuff and adding a little bit of that as part of my flux. And that provides the silica that if it isn't already there in your concentrates. So then there's other additives that you might choose to add to your flux. There's potassium nitrate, normal, sometimes called saltpeter. It's very easily obtained. And so potassium nitrate can go into a flux. It's a good oxidizer. It will help oxidize some of the pyrite to iron oxides that are easier for your flux to handle. Manganese dioxide, that's another oxidizer that's used. Calcium fluoride, I don't recommend using calcium fluoride. Some people will say that that's a thinner. It's really not a thinner. It's really a thickener. So you don't need to make your flux thicker. But you may need an oxidizer, but you may not need an oxidizer. So one of the things that's very common, people ask me about sometimes, well, what about Chapman flux? Well, Chapman flux is, it's sodium carbonate, borax, a little bit of silica, and manganese oxide. Well, you only need manganese oxide if you have a situation where you've got a lot of pyrite and you need to oxidize the ore. The stuff that I have has very little pyrite in it, and a lot of people, if you're just melting placer fines, it's going to have very little pyrite in it in most cases. If you're processing it from hard rock ores like Jason does on his YouTube channel, and I recommend Jason if you're interested in this subject. He's a good channel to check out. But the Chapman flux, if you don't need to oxidize your ore, if you don't have significant sulfides, it's really unnecessary. So my flux that I usually make up is just like 40% sodium carbonate, 40% borax, and maybe 20% silica or glass. And that's really what my flux is. It makes a flux that's thick enough but not too thick. You want to have it pour easily. You don't want it to pour like it's some kind of thick molasses or something like that. You want it thicker than water and not like molasses. So that's a little bit about flux. But the question then becomes, and I'm talking a little bit about what mixture of flux you might want to use. The question then becomes, what amount of flux? And that has to do with how much other stuff, because remember, the purpose of a flux is to help the gold melt and to take up that other junk, the iron oxides, the silica, the black sand, any other non-metal junk that's in your concentrates. Pyrite, of course, is not a metal, even though it has kind of a metallic luster. It's not a metal, it's a sulfide mineral. So the purpose of the fluxing part is to take up that stuff and separate that from your metallic materials, which is your gold and your silver, and so that when you pour, you get a nice, pure, clean metal, and you don't end up with a lot of junk. So what amount depends on how much junk there is in your concentrates. So I've seen guys who've done recovery of gold from electronic scrap. And by the way, I'm going to do a video on that and explain the chemistry a lot better than anybody else on YouTube, so that if you ever get into that, you can understand what you're doing. It's not just like a bread recipe where put 2 cups of this and a tablespoon of that and 4 tablespoons of this and mix it all up, and it's good to understand the chemistry. Anyway, what amount? So I've seen guys who are doing electronics recovery, and they've purified the gold, and they've gotten it real pure, and it's not any junk with it, and they may put just a sprinkle pinch of borax when they melt a several gram little button of gold. And so if you have very little impurities, then you need very little flux. If you have a moderate amount of impurities, you might need 3 or 4 times the weight of your gold or your anticipated gold. Always go a little bit over on the flux. Don't skimp on the flux, because you may have more impurities than you expect, and it doesn't hurt to have a little bit of extra flux. So maybe 4, maybe even 5 times. If you have loads and loads of junk in your concentrates, like some of the stuff that Jason does, he has a lot of sulfides and tries to take care of that. You may have, if you have something that's like 95% other stuff, 5% gold, you need a lot of flux. You might need, 20 or 40 times the amount of the gold you anticipate. So if you anticipate getting 3 grams of gold, you might need 120 grams of flux. If your material's like 5% gold, 95% other stuff. So always go a little bit extra on the flux, and the more impurities you have, the more flux you need. So it's not a simple question. You kind of have to go. And like I say, it's better to have a little bit extra flux than not enough. There are problems with fluxes, and bubbling is one of the biggest ones. If you put in bicarbonate or any of these oxidizers, both potassium nitrate and manganese, decompose and yield oxygen, and it just causes bubbling. And if you haven't melted your gold yet and your flux starts to bubble, it may overflow the crucible that you have, which is a really bad thing. If the gold hasn't melted yet, it may not be on the bottom. It may be still mixed with the liquid flux, and you may spill and lose gold. Even if you don't lose any gold, it's still the spillage of molten flux. It's like lava. It will wreck whatever your furnace is, or however you're doing it. So you don't want to spill. You don't want to have bubbling problems. And one of the things that you do to deal with that is have a plenty large enough crucible so that if it bubbles a little bit, you're not going to have a problem. Sometimes newbies will fill a crucible right up almost to the top of the thing, and then when it melts and bubbles, poof, over the top it goes because there's no extra space in the crucible. So always leave some extra space in your crucible, because you almost always get some bubbling. Depending on if you add these oxidizers to the mix, you're going to get more bubbling. And so be prepared. Be careful, know what you're doing. Then the other thing here I'll talk about before we move on to the next segment is collection agents. Now, Jason, like I say, when he does a lot of his stuff is high other stuff, sulfides and stuff, and limited amounts of actual gold or silver. And so they use a collection agent, and so they may add some lead minerals, or some metallic lead, metallic copper, or metallic bismuth. Jason in the old days used to use lead, and now he's gone to using bismuth because it's less toxic. Both of them are easy to cupel and end up with a pure bit of metal. Copper also will collect very well. It's just harder to cupel. It doesn't soak into the cupel as well. Lead and bismuth do a better job of that. So if you have lots and lots and lots of other stuff and only a little bit of metal, then it's important to use a collection agent like lead or bismuth, copper. Use a collection agent, and then you're going to have to cupel off the collection agent in order to get a pure type of thing. And if you want to see about cupellation and the process, Jason has a whole bunch of videos that talk about that. So when I melt gold, I always have enough gold that the gold itself can act as a collection agent. If you have a number of grams of gold and you're only doing a relatively small melt and it's relatively pure, the gold will collect itself and you won't lose a lot of gold in the slag. So that's when you might want to use a collection agent. Jason uses them, and for good reason. Let's talk next about heat sources. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is, I had to redo the board because I ran out of room, is how to melt, what your heat source is. There are electric crucibles out there, electric systems out there. I do not recommend them, okay? One of the things is really the upper limit on nichrome, which is the heating wire that you have in an electric furnace type system. The upper limit of that is about 1150 centigrade, and the melting point of gold, like I say, is 1064. So it's less than 100 degrees above the melting point, and you want to get to a good amount above the melting point. So it almost requires that you go over the recommended limit. And it's not good for the durability of the furnace. So although I know they sell these things and they say, yes, it will melt gold. The one time I tried to use one, I had a hard time melting silver, and silver melts at almost 100 degrees lower than gold does. So I don't recommend these things. Another thing that I see people use all the time is oxyacetylene torches, And the problem with that is an oxyacetylene torch, it's real easy. You know, you turn the thing on, you adjust it to get the right, color and size of flame. You bring it down there and you're going into all your fine gold. So, you may have all kinds of real fine gold there and you just blew it all over the table and you're going to lose some of it. So I don't recommend that either. It requires real care and use of borax and going slow and melting the borax and making sure that you don't blow that stuff around. So really the way to go is some sort of propane or gas-fired furnace. And you can buy these things. I'm going to show you the little one that I use, but I have a little one and a big one. For people who aren't doing big melts, the little one that I use is perfectly good. It runs on propane. I'll show you the setup that I have where I run it off a propane tank, and it works great. I've used it many times. So it's a good thing. And like I say, a propane furnace, if you're gonna do this, getting a smaller one, and they have a couple of different sizes. It's a worthwhile thing. It's not that expensive. And anyway, I'll show you my setup in a minute. But that's what I recommend. Now, next, let's talk about crucibles and molds, because you have to melt the gold in something, and then you want to pour it into something else, okay? Graphite is a very common thing that you will see for both crucibles and molds. The little furnace that I'm going to use that I'm going to show you in a minute is I have a graphite crucible and I'll be pouring it into a graphite mold. Graphite is a form of carbon. It's very durable. It's very shock resistant, and it works great. The only thing about graphite is I'll talk about this in the little furnace. If you have the little flames impinging on the graphite can burn. Graphite is flammable. It's carbon. It will burn. So you got to be careful with it and handle it right. If you do it right, it's not a problem. It's not a problem when you pour it into the mold. It's not going to burn in the mold. Silicon carbide is another one. It's more resistant. The flames impinging on the silicon carbide won't cause a problem. Silicon carbide is a little more expensive, but it's a very durable crucible kind of thing. I've never seen molds made from silicon carbide, but it makes a great crucible, and I've used silicon carbide crucibles a number of times. A lot of the commercial ones, like if you go to an actual gold mine and they're melting, they're melting it in a crucible that's the size of a 5-gallon bucket, they're melting in a silicon carbide crucible. Next, we have fire clay, and fire clay is another one where crucible, yes, I don't have seen any molds made out of fire clay, but fire clay makes a great crucible. I've mentioned Jason at Mount Baker a number of times in this video, and he always uses various fire clay type crucibles to do his melting in, and he has various sizes, ones from small to quite large. And fire clay is, like I say, you can get it in big sizes, like multi-gallon equivalent. Just like the silicon carbide, you can get those in big sizes. Next, iron. And iron is one that I haven't seen in crucibles, but it's very common in molds. You have cast iron molds, and also mild steel that's been welded together. That's what I use sometimes when I have a big pour. I go into the mild steel. Jason uses mild steel that's been welded together. There are also cast iron type molds for gold bars and that sort of thing. So that's another good option. And then fused silica, another crucible type thing. It's very clean. If you want a totally contaminant free type of crucible, the fused silica is a good choice. So there's some of your choices for your different crucibles and molds. Like I say, what I will be using in this little demonstration is a graphite crucible and a graphite mold, but I've used all different kinds of stuff too. How to pour. Pouring, it just, don't rush it. Think about it before you do it. If you have a crucible here and something you're going to pour into here, you want to grab it back here and pour. You don't want to grab it and then pour across yourself. So, think about what you're doing, plan it in advance, pour into the center of your mold, and don't rush. Pour smoothly and evenly. Don't don't go too fast, and you don't go super slow. You want to just make an even pour that way. So how to pour, pretty simple stuff. And finally, safety. That's of course really very important. Safety issues, absolutely gloves, absolutely long sleeves. You want long gloves too. I have welding gloves that I use that are leather, and they're made for having a little bit of hot stuff splash. And of course, when you're planning your pour, you want zero splash. But good gloves. Vapors and ventilation, those are also important. A number of these different things, especially ores and stuff, can have hazardous materials in them. A lot of gold ores have arsenic, some have antimony, many have lead, all of which are things that can become vapors and be quite toxic. So for sure you want to be melting outdoors at a minimum, and it would be good to have some sort of fume hood if you have that available. But be sure when you're pouring to stand back. You don't want to pour right in your face and have the fumes go up on you. That's kind of crazy. So be aware of the vapors. Be outside, be in a place. I'm going to pour in a building, but you'll see, I'll show you, I got an open door and open window right next to me, and I'm pouring, and then I'm going out the door. So I don't stay and breathe. Ventilation is important, and I know my ore doesn't have any significant amount of arsenic or antimony or lead. So that's a little bit about the basics of pouring. Let's go outside and do it, and I'll show you in person what I do for small pours and what I'm pouring, and we'll go through the whole steps and pour a nice beautiful gold button. I know this is a tight shot. Mostly you're just going to see the furnace and the operation and what I'm doing, but I've put my gold, my mix in here. I mixed up the flux. I put the gold in it. It's in a little jar. I'm going to just kind of spin it around to mix it up. It doesn't need to be super well mixed, but somewhat mixed. And then I have my crucible here, and I'm going to pour the material into the crucible carefully. I don't want to spill it, right? Okay, and then we're going to set this so that we're going to have it right here, and I'm going to start the flame right now. I'm using 2 propane tanks because I have it set up that I can use a large propane tank, but one of the hoses was leaking. So always check your safety stuff beforehand. Okay. Everything's lit. Put that away. Now I can get my tongs and carefully put the thing in, and then the other parts of the crucible are here. It's a spacer, and then we will offset that a little bit. Okay, that really is it for a few minutes. I'm going to turn the camera off because it takes time to heat the mix up and get everything going, and that's going to take a minute, so there's no point in staring at the furnace while it heats up. I have out for me to use. This is a temperature measuring gauge. It reads digitally, it takes pictures, and looks like I just put the flame out. Okay. Okay, we've got her up to temperature, so I'm going to be heating up the mold, heating up the carbon mold. Graphite is a form of carbon. And it takes a few minutes to heat it up, you know, to get it. I'm not going to get it red hot or anything by doing this way, but I will get it up to a few hundred degrees and get it up to where it's really going to be quite warm. Minimizes the thermal shock when I pour the slag and gold into it. Okay, I'm going to start turning off the okay. We have our mold. Set aside the pliers. Take this little gap thing. We'll take this and we'll pour the material right into the mold. I'm getting that effect that Jason gets, where you get the different things on the surface. It's cooling. It'll take some time to cool. Put this stuff on here so that it has a chance to cool slowly. The slag is already solidified, but it's still plenty hot, so I'm going to let it cool and we'll take a look at it in just a few minutes when it's cooled to a more stable, usable temperature. Okay, things are cooling off. Let's set things aside here. Move this out of the way. And I'll get the big pliers to grab the graphite mold. Let's turn this over and see what we get. Okay, there is a metal thing on there. It's kind of covered with. There it is. There's my button. Right there. I'll show you a close-up of it and I'll get the rest of that slag off it. It's got a little bit of slag on the surface.
Okay, well here's the final button. 12.5 grams, or about 12.5 grams right there. All the flux has been removed. It's nice and clean. One of the things about having borax and sodium carbonate is that they're both water soluble. So the flux that didn't easily chip off, I just put this thing in a little bottle of water and let it sit for a couple hours. And then when I took it out, the flux came right off. So it looks great. It's easily to store something like this. You know, I had a whole bunch of little fines from dry washing, and you know, if you spill that or do anything with it, and you're gonna have a hard time getting it back. So in a button like this, you know, if I drop it on the ground, I just pick it right back up. One of these days, I'm going to take a bunch of these buttons that I have that I've collected from over the years and pour them into a larger bar. And that's the kind of thing that's ready to go to a refiner. If I decide that I need the cash and want to cash in some of my gold, it's ready to go. Now, if you like the little kiln or furnace that I use to melt the gold, these are easily available. They're really handy and easy to use. You can get them at High Plains Prospecting, and I'm going to put a link in the description below to the page on their website that has this kiln. And, if you're interested, go ahead and buy one. You can get a 5% discount with using Chris Ralph, as I showed in the description also. And I'll show you more in a minute in this video. Now, finding gold is a skill unto itself, and really what you know makes all the difference in the world. And you have to find the gold before you can melt it and pour it into a button or bar. And I wrote a book. It's called Fistful of Gold, and it's a book to impart to you the skills and knowledge of prospecting for decades that I've gained. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my book right now.
This is my book, Fistful of Gold. It's an encyclopedia of everything you need to know to go out and find gold for yourself. It distills down my 45 years of experience out in the field prospecting, as well as my degree in mine engineering. It's, like I say, an encyclopedia. There's a lot to it. It's over 250,000 words long, hundreds of pages with hundreds of illustrations, teaching you what you need to know about geology, about mining districts, about techniques of finding gold. It covers metal detectors, sluicing, panning, dry washing, high bankers, you name it, it's covered in there. It talks some about platinum and diamonds, but it's mostly about gold because gold is more widespread. It is not so much a book about where to find gold, but a book about how to find gold. Because even if you have a location where gold was mined in the past and you go out there, well, where should you look to be successful in your prospecting, to find the gold that's there? This is the book that's going to tell you that information. I spent most of 10 years writing this book, so I thought a long time about it. It's got, like I say, lots of information and lots of illustrations, and I've had results from people who bought it. It's available on Amazon, but I recommend buying it through High Plains Prospectors, and I'll put a link in the description for buying this book through them. They have a better price than Amazon, and I have a special deal that I'll tell you a little bit more about, where you can get a 5% discount from the price even with that. On Amazon, the book rates a 4.7 out of 5, which means that of all the people that have bought it, they've been really highly satisfied, and I think you, if you buy my book, will be just as highly satisfied as well. Now let's talk a little bit more about High Plains Prospectors. They're a prospecting shop, a mail order prospecting shop that I've partnered with. The deal is that I can get you a 5% discount, a coupon code, and I'm going to put the code to that right here. It's just Chris Ralph, all caps with no space between Chris and Ralph. You put that in there as a discount code and you'll get 5% off their already really good prices. I think it's a great deal where you win by getting a discount, I get a little percentage of that, and they get new business. So if you need prospecting supplies, High Plains is really the way to go. And I'll put information, like I say, in the description more about how you can work with them, because I'm working with them. They really are great guys, a great company. For even more information, I also have a website, and I'm going to show you my webpage and talk a little bit more about that right now.
This is my webpage. It's located at NevadaOutbackGems.com. You can Google it, or I have a link down in the description below. But there's lots of information here, miscellaneous stuff, pictures, some historic information as well, stories. It's got a lot of great fun stuff. You'll probably be interested in it. Now, on all of my YouTube videos, I encourage you guys to ask questions. If you have thoughts, comments, suggestions for things that I ought to look at in my videos, things that you want to find out more about, and I answer 100% of my questions. There's not very many YouTubers out there that answer 100% of their questions. I'm one of the few. And so I will do my best to answer what you have. I mean, I only can write so much. Sometimes the answer is something where I'm going to recommend that you buy the book and read about it. I also ask that you subscribe to my channel, click the bell notification so that every time I come out with a new video, you'll be able to watch it. And like I say, I cover a huge amount of topics. I also have 250 videos that I've already done. And so you can go back through my catalog of videos on YouTube. I'm sure there'll be many videos there that you'll want to take a look at, especially if you have any interest in gold or platinum, diamonds, gemstones, geology, and that sort of stuff. My YouTube site is going to be right up your alley. So I'll see you again real soon. We'll be out in the field and back in the office at the whiteboard, and whether we're looking at gold or platinum, diamonds, gemstones, or other interesting geology, it's going to be fun. You're going to enjoy it, and we'll see you again real soon.